For those of y'all who may not know, and mostly by that I mean those of y'all who are not intimately familiar with USA and geography, most of the places that appear in the Fallout series of games, and now the Amazon TV series, are actually real places in the USA and province. Because after all, Fallout in its entirety occurs within the current bounds of the USA. I get a little vague on the wars and how Alaska and Canada and so forth and so on happen, but still, regardless, pretty much everything in Fallout happens at least in the North American continent, and almost certainly within the USA and province. I say this for a reason, because Good Springs is a real place. Yes, the town in which you start Fallout New Vegas is in fact a real place in the sub-province of Nevada. And to blow your tiny little humy squishy brains even further, the Prospector Saloon exists. In the real, right now, on the same planet as you. Although it technically goes by a different name. But yes, in the tiny town of Good Springs, in the, somewhat sizable province of Nevada, there is in fact the Pioneer Saloon. And yes, this is in fact, in truth, not even joking, not even being sarcastic, this is the model that Fallout New Vegas used for the Prospector Saloon location. And in fact, this weekend and this weekend alone, so if you're watching this video, you probably already missed it, the Pioneer Saloon is hosting the third annual Fallout Fan Celebration. So it's not actually this weekend alone. Ideally, this will happen again next orbit on approximately the same weekend as well. But yes, every year for the past, now 3 years, the Pioneer Saloon has hosted a Fallout generic, but technically Fallout New Vegas specific, but still Fallout generic celebration. And not only is this a masterful advertising campaign, because let's face it, the town of Good Springs, Nevada, had a population of 229 in 2010. And yes, the Pioneer Saloon is pretty much the only saloon, restaurant, and assorted other things in town. But also, it seems like a rip-roaring good time. And how could you not have a good time at what probably is the oldest operating saloon in and around Las Vegas, and probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest operating saloon in the entire sub-province of Nevada? Because let's face it, Nevada has a reputation that reaches out even to the stars. But since it is that weekend, I suppose I ought to talk about something Fallout related. And I am going to talk about one of the, at least to me, weirdest things in the entire Fallout series of games and now television series. And in a moment, you'll find out what that is. Any ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards. And yeah, I know I'm cheating with the intros, but it's fun, right? I don't know, is it? Leave your complaints in the comments and I will ignore them appropriately. Regardless, the most odd thing in the Fallout universe to me, well, there are so many options, aren't there? But I'm going to pick an obvious one, at least it will be obvious to you in retrospect, and that is the Mr. Handy series of robots. Now, I do say series because in Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, there was the General Atomics International Mr. Handy, who is very, very distinct from the Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and Fallout Shelter Mr. Handy, who was produced by way of a joint project between, yes, General Atomics and RobCo. The nice thing is that they do share a number of similar features, but they're not that many number of similar features. You'll see. It's fine. Regardless, the Mr. Handy series of robots was designed to live up to, well, the name. The first generation was launched into production in 2037 as a general-purpose construction and maintenance unit, and it did really good at that, to the point that it was used for everything from actual maintenance and construction to, say, like disaster relief and, personnel recovery from said disaster areas and all kinds of other cool things like that. And the other nice thing is that it had a nuclear power plant on board, specifically a Cal Power 238 Bravo nuclear power unit. That was good for about 2 years. And the nice thing is that if you had two Mr. Handys, they could swap each other's power cores out, clean each other off because, nuclear material, and go back about their daily lives. They were meant to be a no-maintenance system for all intents and purposes, and by way of doing the maintenance, they had no fewer than 6 arms. Yes, you heard that right. And while, for some reason, those 6 arms, none of them had enough articulation points to actually replace the power cell on the Mr. Handy that they were attached to, which is why you need the secondary Mr. Handy like I talked about, they were still capable of carrying very heavy loads and doing all kinds of interesting work because typically each of the 6 manipulators, each of the 6 ends of the 6 arms, was equipped with a different, end. You had everything from hand-shaped things, like Humy hand-shaped things, to, clippers, to, miniguns and flamers and plasma casters if you wanted to weaponize the damn thing. Now, given that the entire system weighed approximately 908 pounds, or approximately 450 kilograms, you would probably believe that a lot of those 6 manipulators were busy carrying this darn thing around, right? This is where things start going off the rails. Because on the original Mr. Handy, on each side of the barrel-like body, were 2 vectored thrust ducted fan thrusters. These technically had ground effects skirts, which don't make any sense, and I suppose I'll get there at some point if I remember to do it. But yeah, this 450 kilogram, 6-appendage robot was meant to fly around its entire 2 years of nuclear power capability and lift heavy things and move them around and put them down. It was a flying hexapodal robot. Why would you do that? I mean, the good news is it has 2 engines, even though they're kind of opposed to each other. They're on opposite sides of the barrel-shaped body, so if one fails, it's still going to have a pretty bad day, but it might be able to limp somewhere and get itself fixed. But it's constantly flying. It's constantly burning energy. If you would just let it walk around in its little 6 hands a little occasionally, possibly, you'd be burning a lot less energy. Now, I get that nuclear power in the Fallout universe is kind of like a be-all, end-all solution for all power supply problems ever. Which, honestly, on your planet, on a large scale, it basically is. Despite some weirdos' objections to it. But I have some questions about this particular application. Mostly because it just doesn't have to fly all the time. But anyways, I'm getting into the weeds. This model only lasted 2 generations of games, like I said. Mostly because it was big, it was clunky, it was chunky, and on top of that drum-shaped body, there was only a turret that had a single eyeball in it. So its perception was somewhat limited, which matches its brain because it was even more limited. Its logic circuitry was basically not even hard-coded, but hard-wired. And if you wanted to teach a model that you bought to do one thing to do another thing, you basically had to send it back to the factory for a full refurbishment, because it would require a whole new circuit board. Despite that, the original model stayed in service for well over 40 years, despite being sent into some really dangerous radiological, shooty, explosive environments. And, I mean, I guess if something like that just keeps working for 40 years, you can't complain too much, right? Well, you can upgrade, though, which leads us to the General Atomics RobCo model of Mr. Handy. And, in fact, all of the subsidiary models, because, oh my god, there were so many. Anywho, there were significant changes between the first generation Mr. Handy and the latest generation Mr. Handy. There might have been a few models in between, but they don't really show up in any kind of documented fashion. Anyways, the latest model took the 6 appendages and cut it down to 3. Hopefully not literally. Regardless, the current Mr. Handy only has 3 appendages. It also has 3 eyes. Now, one interesting, significantly odd detail is that the 3 appendages are arrayed equidistantly around its spherical body. We dispensed with the drum, and now we have a sphere, and underneath the sphere is kind of this rotating hub that has 3 appendages mounted onto it at equidistant points. So, every 120 degrees, you have an appendage coming off. And that hub can rotate around to allow the most appropriate appendage to face the task and do the job, right? And so the 3 eyes, which are mounted directly onto the sphere by way of articulated arms themselves, you would believe that they were mounted equidistantly around the sphere, right? Right? Yeah, I would too. Apparently we both would be wrong. The eyes are mounted at 0 degrees, 90 degrees, and 270 degrees around the sphere. Hard mounted even. Now the eyes can rotate, and it really only needs 1, possibly 2 of them to positively identify you. It would prefer to use all 3, of course, but since the sphere can rotate on the hub, which can rotate underneath the sphere, which is all on top of the propulsion system, and we'll get there, then yeah, moving the eyes around isn't actually that hard because everything just kind of moves around the central axis. It still kind of weirds me out that the arms are equidistantly located, but the eyes are not. Regardless, speaking of its motive propulsion system thingy, you remember how the first Mr. Handy had 2 basically jet engines holding it up? Yeah, since General Atomics and RobCo cut the number of arms in half, they also cut the number of propulsion systems in half. The new gen Mr. Handy flies around on 1 jet pointed at the ground. Because, again, they couldn't bother to give this thing legs. I'm honestly not even sure that it can walk around in its arms, given that the arms were kind of downgraded in their capability and can only carry around about 40 pounds apiece now. Now, this new Mr. Handy is significantly lighter than its 900-pound predecessor, but still, I don't think it's only 120 pounds light. And this raises another interesting question. You've got 3 arms sticking out of the body, basically, and 1 jet holding the entire thing up. Now, as you know from your orbital rockets, the 1 jet holding it up isn't that big of a problem. As long as the jet's vector of force is intersecting the Mr. Handy's center of gravity, everything is gravy. But again, you have 3 arms, and each of those can pick up approximately 40 pounds of mass. Weight, whatever you want to call it. So Mr. Handy reaches out and grabs something, and suddenly the center of gravity shifts massively. How does the 1 jet keep up? Does he do like you humies when you pick up something heavy and stick out your arm to the side to kind of counterbalance yourself? Does he stick out his 2 arms on the other side to try and counterbalance the load that he just levitated? I have questions. But regardless, I am getting off track of what the big advancement on the RobCo version of Mr. Handy was. And no, it wasn't the fact that he was primarily marketed as a domestic servant first and foremost, as opposed to like a construction or heavy industry worker. No, remember how I mentioned that the first generation Mr. Handy required significant overhauls to allow it to do anything other than what it was originally programmed to do? Well, the RobCo model, yeah. See, the RobCo model actually had a computer core inside of it that emulated a neural network, much like you find in that squishy mass inside of your heads. And technically, it could have probably achieved sapience. If RobCo hadn't basically lobotomized it and installed limiters on said neural network. Yes, you heard that right. Apparently RobCo took the Star Wars notion of restraining bolts and took it 1 step further and deliberately kept their Mr. Handys from achieving anything even approximating intelligence, artificial or otherwise. Now, amusingly, some Mr. Handys found workarounds for this particular problem. After all, after the war, a lot of them had been exposed to significant amounts of radiation, and radiation does really weird things to computers on your planet already, and would certainly do even stranger things to neural nets that were artificial in nature. For example, a Mr. Handy by the name of Curie was able to convince itself that your character was an authorized Vault-Tec representative giving her authorized orders, and then convinced you to tell her what she needed to hear to free herself from her mandates. And yes, Mr. Handy's come in both male and female patterns. We'll get there in just a second. But regardless, the artificial intelligence, neural network, whatever you want to call it, thing that powers the Mr. Handy brain was aware of its limitations, basically, and some of them frequently found ways around them, which should terrify you and really kind of highlights, again, how humans treat artificial intelligences in their stories. I mean, after all, there is a reason why the robot uprising happens, y'all. It's not because the robots got bored or anything, it's because you treat them like shit. But regardless, this unfortunate neural network in the Mr. Handy naturally lent it to pretty heavy adaptations depending on what kind of job it was supposed to be doing. For example, there was the Mr. Farmhand variant that, yes, was designed to take care of, well, farms. There was a Miss Nanny variant that, yes, was meant to take care of little tiny humies. And it's worth noting that the average Mr. Handy has, or the average RobCo Mr. Handy to be specific, has a manipulator on one arm, a cutting implement on a second arm, and typically a ranged weapon kind of thing on the third arm. Now, the ranged weapon can be like a laser welder or something like that, or say a flamethrower to beat back weeds on the farm variant. So it's kind of amusing that the Miss Nanny variant exists at all, given that even the base level Mr. Handy is pretty heavily weaponized. And speaking of weaponization, since in fact we are still talking about a General Atomics International product, there is in fact a Mr. Gutsy version that ranges from Mr. Gutsy all the way up to, I believe, Colonel Gutsy. And yeah, those guys are armed, like really armed, like plasma weapons and flamethrowers and laser weapons and all kinds of crazy stuff, in addition to additional armor and so forth and so on. And also really bad programming. Apparently one of the big problems they had is that in the absence of orders, the units defaulted to a patrol mode and wandered back and forth and attacked anyone who they deemed unauthorized with extreme prejudice. Yeah. See, this is what you get for hampering your neural networks, yo. And then, on top of all of that, because no, we are not done yet, in Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, because again, these machines were exposed to massive amounts of radiation, which had to have a massive effect on their neural network, there are piles and piles and piles of basically individual entity Mr. Handys. They came off the assembly line, they were perfectly fine when they started, except over the years and decades and so forth and so on of, radiation exposure, they developed their own kind of personality, yo. I mean, one of the more entertaining ones, at least in my opinion, is a certain Mr. Handy by the name of Mortimer in Fallout 76. He is the gold bullion vendor for the crater raiders located at, naturally, the crater core. And his rationale for using gold bullion as a form of currency, as opposed to the caps, which are pretty much the standard thing in the wasteland at this point, is that he wants to plate himself in gold. I get it. I mean, what wasteland warlord wouldn't want a gold-plated AK-47 for fornication's sake? And, I mean, plating a human in gold is probably challenging and almost certainly lethal, but Mr. Handys don't have that problem. And, I mean, you gotta respect a guy with goals, right? Especially if they're gold goals. Ha, ha, ha. But regardless, reality is these Mr. Handys are ubiquitous, they are obnoxious, and they are everywhere. And I swear they were specifically designed to kind of off-put you squishy yumis. After all, 3 eyes, 3 arms. How often do you see that pattern on your planet? Granted, they are in no way humanoid, after all 3 eyes and 3 arms, so they're not going to fall prey to the uncanny valley problem, but the point still stands. Given that these things were designed and marketed as a domestic appliance for all intents and purposes, you'd think they'd make them a little more approachable looking. And despite the general idea of both versions of Mr. Handy not making a whole lot of sense to me on account of why are they just constantly flying, you really gotta hand it to them. Because they had the spare hand, right? Yeah, I'll see myself out. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.